Hi, yeah, we're back on. So I'm in Daniel 8 today. I accidentally skipped from 7 to 9 yesterday, which is, I'm going to blame that on a scribal error, but anyways. So I'm going to do 8, or attempt to do 8, of Daniel. Pretty weird book when you look at it. So we did 7 and 9 yesterday. Both of them hard to decipher what exactly is going on there. 8 is no different, so we'll just kind of see where the Spirit leads. I've been doing some work on it, but there's just only so much you can do with prophetic literature. Eventually you just got to kind of trust God to help you along the way, so and fill in the gaps. So let's start, and I'm going to open with prayer. Lord, I pray that you bless this time. We invoke the presence of your Spirit to help us to interpret the things you have written about in your book, your law, your scriptures, that we might better understand them. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so this is 8. So I'm just going to start working through this, see where it goes. So in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, so Belshazzar, if you read the first half of the book, he's the last king of Babylon. And if you trace Daniel spans through 2 major empires, right? So Nebuchadnezzar comes, he takes and he sacks Jerusalem, and he moves the Israelites east to his provinces in Babylon. After Nebuchadnezzar, he has a son who rules in his place, but his son, in an effort, I believe, to fulfill basically a holy duty which is given to him by, I would assume, his god, which was probably like Nabu or Bel or Marduk or something. He goes to Tema and he tries to revive a holy site in Tema, and while he's there, Belshazzar rules. And while Belshazzar is ruling, God destroys the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the Persians take over. So now we're to a prophecy about the end of the Persian Empire. So if you talk about how this is fulfilled in the Old Testament period, it's the Persian Empire. So this chapter focuses a lot on Persia, Alexander the Great, the Greek empires, and then towards the end of it, it focuses on Antiochus Epiphanes, who claimed to be God and attacked the Jews. But I also think it's got some fulfillments that'll happen at the end of time too. So we'll talk about that too. And if you trace out how all of this stuff is parallel, I think, to the stories in the first half of the book. So the first story is the story about Nebuchadnezzar having a dream. And in the dream, Nebuchadnezzar sees a great statue. If you look at the first vision talks about 4 kingdoms, just like Nebuchadnezzar's dream does. The second vision, I think, probably correlates to the fiery furnace, where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are thrown into a fiery furnace and have to trust God. And it's kind of weird because you think to yourself, okay, how does this correlate? But what's sort of interesting is, I think if I read this properly, is this chapter focuses on how God's people simply have to trust him in the midst of this fallen age, which is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego had to do in order to get out of it, right? And then what's interesting is the third vision, which I talked about yesterday, if you want to see me talking about that, focuses on the restoration of a fallen king, right? So we'll keep going, though. So in the 3rd year of the reign of Belshazzar, and Belshazzar just means Bel, save me. So Bel was the god that Belshazzar devoted himself to. And Bel was a title, so you notice like Bel, Baal, you hear about Baal a lot in the Old Testament. Baal and Bel are related words. So Bel is the title Lord. And if I had to guess, this is referring to Marduk, and Marduk was kind of the chief deity of Babylon. And what's kind of interesting is you see in the book Daniel, it really focuses a lot on Marduk and Nabu. And Nebuchadnezzar is named after Nabu. And if you look at that and compare it to Western mythology, Marduk would be Zeus and Nabu would be Apollo. Okay. So if you want to put it in like the terms of the West, they're talking about Zeus and Apollo. Okay. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa. So Susa actually is a major city of the Persian Empire too. So it's kind of interesting. This is towards the end of the Babylonian Empire, but he's in a Persian city. So it kind of notice there's a transition happening, which is in the province of Elam. So this is kind of like, towards the east of the Babylonian Empire. And I looked in the vision, and I myself was beside the Ulai Canal. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram which had 2 horns was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. So the Persians were the Medo-Persian Empire. And if you kind of study what Daniel says about the ascent of the Medo-Persian Empire, the first great king of Persia is Darius the Mede, right? But then the Persians take over under Cyrus. And Cyrus was really the great conqueror of the Persian Empire. That's why it's called the Persian Empire. So he's talking about those 2 kingdoms coming into an alliance between the Medes and the Persians. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power, but he did as he pleased, and he magnified himself. So Persia already kind of had a domain east, right? So Persia's modern Iran, and actually, if you study Iran, they speak Farsi, which is modern Persian, right? So they don't speak Arabic, they speak Persian. So this is an eastern originating empire, right? But they spread all the way out west. And if you study the Persian Empire, they conquered huge amount of land going kind of out, fanning out kind of like west, but also they already had a pretty big domain further east. And they conquered, pretty much all the Babylonian territory. They conquered Egypt. They conquered Turkey. If you've seen the movie 300, they tried to conquer Greece, right? Didn't end well, but they did attempt to do it. And got pretty close, actually. I would say God intervened because he didn't want that to happen. Okay, while I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram, and horns in ancient symbolism are a symbol of power, right? So if a bull gets you, it gets you with its horns, right? Which I had seen standing in front of the canal and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. So this goat charges the ram. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. So if you study the destruction of Persia by Alexander the Great, this is basically what happens. And the final emperor of the Persians, he's a Darius. He dies in complete humiliation. That's the end of Persia. He totally shatters Persia, and then out of that comes the 4 Greek empires. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So after Alexander dies, you see the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemaic Empire, the Antigonids, and you also have, there's one in Turkey too. And then also it's kind of interesting, there's this other kind of like cross empire in Bactria that's both Greek and Indian. So there's a lot of, the power spreads out pretty vast. And actually, a lot of the power the Romans grabbed when they were expanding, they stole from the Hellenistic empires, which came out of Alexander the Great's conquest. A lot of their conquests were of Greek-speaking territories. And that's why the New Testament was written in Greek. The Greek was like the French of the ancient world because Alexander the Great conquered everything. And if you were educated, you spoke Greek. Latin was spoken by a lot of people, but everybody spoke Greek, right? So out of one of them came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, and toward the beautiful land. So the beautiful land is the Holy Land. And this little horn is Antiochus Epiphanes the Fourth. So this is a Seleucid emperor, right? So the Seleucids kind of held the Middle Eastern portion of the Greek empires. And Antiochus Epiphanes was an emperor of the Seleucids who claimed to be God, right? So Epiphanes means manifest. He claimed to be God manifest, right? So it's kind of a title of divinity. And what we're going to find, and this is what he did, is he heavily persecuted the Jews. So prior to this, the Ptolemies and the Seleucids were patrons of Jewish culture. Although frequently the Jews became corrupted by Hellenistic culture in a lot of ways. But I mean, this is just common in world history. But the Jews became corrupted by it. But for a period of time, the Greeks supported Jewish culture. It's not till Antiochus Epiphanes that the Greeks start destroying Jewish culture. And this only lasts for a short period of time. This is where Hanukkah comes from. So it even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host. So he's claiming to be Yahweh, basically, which is what, that's what Antiochus basically claimed. And it removed the regular sacrifice from him, and the place of his sanctuary was thrown down. And on account of transgression, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that particular one who was speaking, "How long will the vision about the regular sacrifice apply, while the transgression causes horror, so as to allow both the holy place and the host to be trampled?" He said to me, "For 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the holy place will be properly restored." So a lot of this does get pretty confusing. But if you look at it from an Old Testament perspective, this is Antiochus. Okay, so this is a Greek-speaking, and their capital was in Syria. So they had a capital, Antioch, right? So Antioch in Syria was their capital, and there were a lot of Antiochs throughout the empire. So he has a capital in Syria. He spreads out. He conquers the Ptolemies almost, right? But the Romans come up and say, no, because the Romans intervened in all kinds of political affairs by this time. So it's one thing, the Romans were kind of like America in a lot of ways, right? So if somebody messes with an ally of America, we show up and we try to broker a deal. And the Romans would do this too. So if something went wrong in Rome's sphere of influence, the Romans would show up and they'd say, no, that's not going to happen, or here's how you can do it instead. So the last time Antiochus came against the Ptolemies, and the Ptolemies were the Egyptian part of the Greek Empire, the Romans showed up and said, no, you're not going to do that, you're going to go home. And that's what Antiochus did. He went home. But on his way home, he sacks the Israelites, basically wipes out Torah while he's there, and everybody caves except one guy, this one priest living out in a little nowhere village called Modin. And this is where Judas Maccabeus comes from. So, that's all right, Ed. So Judas Maccabeus and his father starts a rebellion against Antiochus. And they, through this kind of guerrilla operation in the providence of God, they drove the Greeks out and they restored worship in the holy place. So they rededicated the temple. And what Antiochus did is he started sacrificing to Zeus on the Temple Mount. Okay, but so he started offering sacrifices to Zeus on the Temple Mount. And this was a horrific time for the Jews. So Hanukkah is a celebration of the Jews restoring the worship of Yahweh in the Holy Land. It's really what it is. And when when the Maccabees took back over Jerusalem, and there were a bunch of Maccabean brothers, and they just kept dying, right? But when they took Jerusalem back over, they had to rededicate the temple. And the miraculous thing was that the oil to light the Mishnah, or not the Mishnah, but the lamp in the holy place, it kept regenerating itself miraculously. And that's what Hanukkah is about, right? So they kept having oil, even though, and you had to have, consecrated oil for that. So somehow it just kept regenerating itself, which is, kind of a cool story. To put it roughly, it's essentially what happened. So this is basically what this chapter is talking about. But then you get into the awkward question of, okay, but this seems to also be talking about the end of time. And we'll read on here, but you'll see by the end of the chapter, he's not just talking about the Old Testament. They're also talking about the end of time. And Daniel has this kind of awkward tension in it, where you can tell a lot of it references stuff in the Old Testament, but it seems to be jumping out of the Old Testament into something that hasn't happened yet, and this occurs frequently in Daniel. So you end up in this kind of awkward predicament of, okay, what applies to the Old Testament, what applies to the end of time? And you see this in commentaries too. So you read a commentary on Daniel, and the guy will reach a point and he'll go, okay, this is as much as we can explain with like Hellenistic history, for instance, but it breaks down, right? And after a certain point, you go, okay, we're not really sure. So it's a tension in Daniel, and it makes it hard to interpret Daniel. How do you do that? So when I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, standing before me was one who looked like a man. And I heard the voice of a man between the banks of Ulai, and he called out and said, Gabriel, give this man an understanding of the vision, right? So this is a divine conversation. So Yahweh says to Gabriel, who's one of the archangels, explain this to Daniel. So he came near to me where I was standing, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face. So Gabriel's clearly a pretty significant player, because Gabriel means like warrior of God, essentially. So he's no minor angel. And he shows up in the New Testament again, right? So he announces to, for instance, Mary, the Annunciation comes from Gabriel. He tells her that she's going to conceive the Christ. So, Son of Man, understand that the vision pertains to the time of the end. See, and now you get into this tension spot, right? So he's talking about the time of the end, right? So you can explain almost all of this with ancient history, but then you get Gabriel shows up and he tells us, we're not just talking about ancient history. We're also talking about stuff way towards the end. And if you look up the Hebrew word for end, kates, it means like just generically the end, right? Now that's an interesting sticking point, right? Because if you think about it, the arrival of the Messiah, so the arrival of Jesus, was a sort of end, right? So it's not to say this doesn't pertain to the time of the end, right? Because what was Jesus' biggest message? The kingdom is coming, right? Which is an apocalyptic message, by the way. So Jesus did usher in the apocalyptic age. He ushers, and notice, right, in his, the last book he inspired, or I think like second, fourth to last, something like that. Revelation comes towards the end of the ministry of John. And if you kind of look at the chronologies of how the Revelation was written, it's probably written before John wrote the Gospel of John. But Jesus, it's like one of the last things he talks about is the end of time. So he's telling, he closes his message with the end of time, but he also begins his message with the end of time. Because if you study what Jesus says, he says, the kingdom of God has come near, right? Which is an apocalyptic message. And that's kind of interesting. In the early 20th century, there was a renaissance of people realizing Jesus' message, a lot of it was about the end of time, right? Now, while he was talking to me, I sank into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, right? So this is one of those funny things about encountering divine beings like this, right? It about wipes out Daniel, right? He falls over like asleep. So you notice like the power of these beings. They're extremely powerful. But he touched me and he made me stand upright. He said, behold, I'm going to let you know what will occur at the final period of the indignation, for it pertains to the appointed time of the end. So yet again, we see it's the end of the time that this passage is talking about. It's kind of, that word indignation is kind of like interesting, right? So it can mean like a curse, essentially. So if you look it up, the word is za'am, okay? So it can mean like almost like a curse, either against God or like his prophets, okay? Or it can just mean like a general curse. So clearly what this seems to be referring to is a period of time where God's word will be suppressed, okay? The ram which you saw with the two horns represents the kings of Media and Persia. Okay, so he explicitly says this is the Persian Empire. The shaggy goat represents the kingdom of Greece, and the large horn that is between his eyes is the first king. All right, so yet again, it's clear there's a fulfillment of this in the Old Testament. Very obvious, right? The broken horn and the four horns that arose in its place represent the four kingdoms which will arise from his nation, although not with his power. So yet again, when you study ancient Greek history, 4 kings came out of Alexander the Great. Okay, so Alexander the Great takes Greek culture and he exports it, but he dies, right? 323, Alexander the Great just like randomly dies of like a fever. And when he dies, he distributes his empire. Okay. Represent 4 kingdoms which will arise from his nation, right? So they arise from the Greeks, although not with his power, right? So like, Cleopatra probably didn't look like an Egyptian. She looked like a Greek, right? So she was Mediterranean. Although, I mean, obviously the Egyptians were Mediterranean too, but she had more of a kind of a Greek face and stuff. In the latter period of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, a king will arise, insolent and skilled in intrigue. And if you study Antiochus Epiphanes, he was that way, right? He murdered his infant nephew, for instance, to have sole control of the empire. Pretty messed up guy, right? Skilled in intrigue. And he was pretty conniving. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. And he will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people, right? So he afflicts God's people. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. And he will magnify himself in his heart, and he will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. The vision of the evenings and mornings, which has been told, is true, but keep the vision secret, for it pertains to many days in the future. And the many days in the future thing, let me find that. Okay. So it's kind of interesting. If you go to, hang on, and sometimes this gets confusing because you compare the Greek and the Hebrew verse counts, and or English and Hebrew verse counts, and sometimes they're slightly different, which can be a lot of fun in a situation like this. Okay, so in verse 25, it talks about he's going to be broken, but not by a human hand. Okay, not by hand. So that's God's hand. When it talks about God's hand, right, that's expressing like his power. But the center of your power is your hand, right? That's where you... Oh, thanks, Ashley. The center of your power is your hand, right? It's where you do stuff. Also kind of a weird thing, but sorry, this isn't aside. But if you read the story about how Jehu killed Jezebel, what's kind of funny about it is all that's left is her palms, right? So the center where she was doing all the evil she did, the dogs wouldn't eat it, right? So like, it's a commentary on like how awful they considered her to be, right? So they didn't even eat her palms, right? Because that's where she was doing all that evil stuff, which is kind of like funny. And they didn't eat her skull either, because that's where she conceived of it, right? The Bible's pretty funny, but it's funny. You read that, and like to us, it's like, what is the point of that detail? But you have to remember, in the Old Testament, they have a much more vibrant vision of humanity, right? So, how do I put this? We tend to see human existence in this very kind of sterile way because we've been trained to think with a Western mind, right? Modern Western mind. But the Bible is very colorful because it doesn't have that kind of very rationalist vision of life, obviously, right? It's very, it's still, in its world, it's still very much enchanted, as like, an anthropologist or a philosopher would say. Reality is still imbued with meaning, right? Whereas in the Western world, we kind of bleached the meaning out of reality and said that the real meaning comes from mind, right? And there's nothing outside of human mind. So we think of reality, we call it what we want it to be, that's what it is. And if you notice how modern people operate, that's very much how they operate. But in the ancient world, that's not how they thought about it, right? Reality itself had a meaning that's not based in me. And I think that's actually more accurate, personally. If you want my opinion, I think that's more accurate. All right, so 26. Okay, so the vision of the evening and the morning, which, okay, so that's a niffle, has been told, is true. Okay, so God's word is true. It's using a word that's pretty common in the Old Testament for like the truth of God. So emeth, which is where the word amen comes from. They're related. And you And this is funny. He tells him to like seal up this or keep secret this scroll. So shut up what you've seen. Just shut it up, right? Don't let people know what it is. Because the vision, because it's towards like many days from now, right? So it's towards days which are like way off in the future. Oh, hey, Mrs. Vogel, how you doing? I'm teaching you. That's funny. You know, Mrs. Vogel taught me health, so this is kind of funny, but this is great. I'll shut up. All right. And then I, Daniel, was exhausted and sick. She did a great job, by the way. That's a great teacher. Then I got up again and carried on the king's business, but I was astounded at the vision, and there was none to explain it. Okay? So there we go. That's chapter 8. We've kind of just shotgunned through it. So now I'm going to kind of tell you, all right, so that's the first pass. That's the Old Testament. Then you get into the question, okay, so what does this mean? Because it's talking about the time of the end too, right? So the Kates, okay? Ha-Kates, time of the end. Which makes it extraordinarily confusing because the whole thing can totally apply to the Old Testament too, right? As most of these prophecies can when you read them, but they have a moment where they kind of break down, and that's the awkward point. So Antiochus Epiphanes did, right, kind of magnify himself and compare himself to God, and he slaughtered God's people and did all those things. But some of this stuff doesn't seem to quite like fit the bill for Antiochus either, because, I mean, his power was fairly limited. He destroyed the Holy Land, but he was by no means like a world conqueror. On the world scene, he was so-so, right? The Seleucids were powerful, but if you notice, by the time he shows up, he's basically under the power of Rome, right? The Romans get him to run away from Egypt. So he's not as powerful as he likes to claim. So you end up in kind of this awkward tension of, okay, so is this Antiochus? Well, clearly it is, right? Because it talks about the Medes and the Greeks. But then again, it seems to break down at points. So I'll kind of try to build on what I just said to kind of update it a bit too. And then again, you go to chapter 7 and you see the four kingdoms do seem to work in the ancient world, right? So Rome is this terrifying iron kingdom that comes out of nowhere and chomps up the known world. But then again, it doesn't conquer the whole world, right? And if you study Revelation, the kingdom of the beast is the whole world, right? It's not just the Mediterranean basin and kind of the surrounding parts. So that puts you in kind of an awkward spot. How do you deal with this? Which is why I was very reluctant to do this one on Facebook, because this is a particularly challenging chapter of Daniel. So, all right, let's break it down. So you got a ram, and it's got two horns, okay? Now, it's sort of weird, but if you go to chapter 7 and you update it, I think what happens in chapter 7 is it talks about the ancient world, and it talks about the time of the end. And there's a lion, a bear, a leopard, and then the scary thing that nobody's seen before. Okay, Daniel's like, what is that? I don't want to see that at the zoo, right? It's kind of, I don't know if I want to look at that cage, right? That's kind of scary. It's got iron teeth. And if you read it, it's sort of like this interesting thing, right? It's like, what is that? And Daniel's like, I want to know about that one. What's that one, right? What's that thing with that crazy horn coming out of it? So it's not just about the time of Daniel. It comes to a later time too. So again, you see this tension in Daniel between what was going on back then and what's going to go on in the future. And if you study how scholars talk about prophecy now, a lot of times they say this is kind of more what it's like. They have this thing in prophetic scholarship of the Bible where they talk about rectilinear versus like kind of a multiple fulfillments theory, okay? So if you go to like, I would say like the 20th century particularly, they had this idea every prophecy has one fulfillment, okay? That's called rectilinear, right? It goes right and it stops, right? That's what it means, right line, okay? So it's like a timeline, right? So you have the prophecy about the Messiah being born of a virgin, bam, right? Jesus, we're done, okay? But if you study modern scholarship on that passage in Isaiah, they would say, well, it had a fulfillment in that time, and then it also had a fulfillment in Jesus, right? So there's two different ways you can talk about prophecy. And in my opinion, the second one's more accurate. A lot of times prophecies are like a skipping stone across a lake, right? So it hits the water, it keeps skipping, it hits the water multiple times, and it stops. So I think that's more what Daniel's doing. It's got a fulfillment in the ancient world. It's going to have a fulfillment now, too, or towards some later time, which I think is kind of starting to kick off. All right, so a griffin who turns into a lion, a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, a leopard that flies across the earth, and then the scary thing is what the chapter 7 talks about, and I talked about that yesterday. All right, so what's interesting is you see this same imagery in Revelation. So the Antichrist, when he is turned into a beast in prophetic literature, I mean, obviously he'll be a dude, but in prophetic literature it symbolizes him. He is a leopard with the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. That's kind of interesting. So he's a hybrid of these 3 kingdoms in Daniel. That's sort of interesting. So you see, the beast arises out of these other kingdoms and kind of takes them all over, okay? And what I said is, I think the lion is the British Empire, the bear is America, and the leopard is a kingdom that hasn't yet arisen yet, okay? And the interesting thing about the lion is it's kind of this angelic kingdom that's set down on the earth, and the lion stands up and becomes a human. Now, it's kind of hard to know exactly what that means, but here's one way you could look at that with, like, the British Empire, for instance. The British Empire is descended from the Celts, right? So if you study European history, the Celts were an extremely powerful people who conquered pretty much all of Europe except Germany before the Romans did. But the interesting thing about the Celts is they were tribal. So the Celts did not have a unified imperial system like the Romans did. They had these tribedoms, as did the Romans actually, but the Romans were more unified. And the Celtic Empire was very powerful in its day. And they invaded Europe like in the 6th century BC from the east, took it over and, ran it pretty successfully until Julius Caesar. And then Julius Caesar showed up, and that was kind of the end of the Celts. And Julius Caesar conquered all of the Celtic territories all the way up to the British Isles. But the part of the Celtic Empire he did not conquer, he didn't conquer Scotland, he didn't conquer Ireland, and I'm not sure if he conquered Wales, I'm not sure. He might have conquered Wales, but he didn't conquer like the very northwest chunk of the Celtic Empire, like the very tip of it. So the Brits kind of arose out of the remains of the Celtic Empire. And the thing about the Celtic Empire is it was extremely magical. The Druids basically ruled them, and they were kind of like these kind of magician kings almost. And people still talk about the Druids, right? So the Druids, nobody really knows where they came from, but they were sort of these religious kings of the Celts. They were like their own race almost. Had their own alphabet, their own way of doing things, and were kind of these magical nature worshippers. So it's kind of interesting is if you think about it from that angle. One way Yahweh could be talking about the Celtic Empire, which arose towards the end of time, is it's kind of a settling down of that magical nature into this more rational nature, right? So the heart of a man is, you're talking about kind of more of a rational approach to reality. And if you look at the British Empire, Brits to this day are very empirical, they're very down-to-earth people, right? If you talk to any Brit, that's how they are, right? So they're much more kind of like down-to-earth people. Common sense was kind of an invention of the British Empire. So that's one way of looking at it. And a lion or a griffin is a very common symbol in like British mythology and heraldry and stuff. So that's one way you could look at it. I think the bear is America. Okay, so the bear is a frontier animal, right? How many bears are out west in America? Like we have grizzlies and black bears and all kinds of stuff. And it's got 3 ribs in its mouth. That's America, right? So America was built off the British Empire, the Spanish Empire, and the French Empire, right? The Louisiana Purchase. We purchased that part of it. That was an easy conquest, but everybody thought it was kind of stupid at the time. And then the Spanish Empire, we eviscerated what was left of the Spanish Empire up here by conquering kind of the Mexican territories. And then we conquered Mexico too, but we gave it back, which is kind of crazy. And then also if you study the origins of America, right, we came out of England, right? So 3 empires. And honestly, the chief one we arose out of is this Lion Kingdom, right? But the other 2 I don't think have showed up yet. So America is kind of the major player right now. Major player, right? America is extremely powerful. We're the Rome, right? Today, we're Rome. And what's interesting is America is extremely religious. but it's also very rational. And that's kind of how the Persians were. They were more of a hybrid empire. So the Persians were not as rational as the Greeks, but they were very rational. If you study their empire, it was extremely well run. But they also had this very mystical view of reality, right? If you study like their religion and stuff, it's pretty mystical stuff. And the Greeks had that, but the Greeks were heavily influenced by philosophy by this point in history, so they're much more rationalists. So I think that's kind of what's going on there. If you study America, we are always caught in this tension between down-to-earth religion and rationalism, which is sort of interesting. So if you think about that, it's not necessarily a bad comparison between Persia and America in some ways. And also Persia was this massive empire, so was America. It's a pretty incredible country, right? And we have essentially taken over the world through economics. But we don't dominate the world through military might. Rather we have rather heavily influenced the world through economics and through our work ethic and through capitalism. So, kind of interesting. But we've built our empire out of these three European empires. And America is, it's a country you can't mess with, and you can't mess with a bear. I mean, what do you do with a bear, right? You can't run, you can't climb. The best thing you can do is maybe swim, but they can swim too. I mean, bears are scary, right? Hopefully you have a shotgun when you meet a bear, right? If it comes after you, because that's what it's going to take, like a 12 gauge to the gut. All right, so that's the two empires I think that have already been fulfilled in these Daniel prophecies. Now, I think chapter 8 is about a transition, which will come at a later time, where America will be superseded by another world empire, an Alexander the Great type empire. So I think what will happen is the whole world will be unified by an emperor who will come towards the end of time. Hard to know when exactly that will be, but I think that's coming towards the end. And I think Revelation prophesies him. I believe he's the white rider character in Revelation. Okay. And he's Greco, right? So it's kind of interesting. You study this white rider character. He's a very Apollonic symbol, right? So he rides around. He's this white rider, and he uses a bow, and he rides on a white horse, which are all kind of Apollo symbols. And one of the chief gods of the Greeks was Apollo, right? So, and the symbol of their rationalism was Apollo. And what's kind of interesting is Nietzsche, if you've ever read his stuff, he referred to this age as the Apollonic era, right? So everything's been very influenced by kind of Greek rationalism. But I think if you kind of look at it, the guy who shows up in Revelation will be heavily influenced by Western culture. Right? So he's not going to be he's not going to be this kind of mystical figure. He'll be more of a rationalist. I mean, hard to know, though. I mean, this stuff's all pretty vague, but this is just me tinkering around with it. So, hard to know, but okay. So then you get to chapter 8, you have a ram and a goat, right? So the ram's got two horns, okay? So notice this is all pretty loose, but it's kind of interesting. You could very easily split America still between the North and the South. We still do, right? And there's kind of like a northern influenced America and a southern influenced America. And America was built out of the North and the South. And originally the more powerful part of America was the South. If you study the history of America, a lot of the scholarship, a lot of the influence, a lot of the wealth came out of the southern part of the United States, right? So Thomas Jefferson was from Virginia, right? A lot of the most powerful guys in the early American Republic were from the South. A lot of the military might, and those plantations were heavily lucrative operations, right? That changed in the Civil War, and after the Civil War, the North took over, right? And all the wealth went north because the North destroyed the Southern economy. That's not me commenting on slavery or anything, that's just what happened, right? And obviously slavery needed to be eradicated, but that, if you just look at it from like an economic historical perspective, that's what happens. And I guess if I'm right about all this, at some later point in the future, the ram, let's see, how is it? And also what's interesting is a ram is a symbol of Jesus, right? And it's a symbol of like a holy animal in the Old Testament. And America is heavily dominated by Christian theology. Not that everybody is Christian, but we are heavily influenced by Christendom, right? By Christian theology. So he came up to the ram that had two horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and he rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram, and he shattered his horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground, he trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. So if I'm right about this, what'll happen is whenever this other guy shows up, America will fall. I don't think necessarily be destroyed, but it'll be superseded by whoever this is. And I think this could be linked to the White Rider figure in Revelation, okay, who's going to be kind of this guy who just rushes out and conquers. And then out of this, right, so just like out of Alexander the Great's empire, there came kind of this weirdo claimed to be God. Same thing will happen in this guy's empire, right? There'll be this weirdo who arises out of it. He'll claim to be God. And he's not going to be of any kind of like nobility or anything. He will just steal the throne through intrigue, which is kind of what Antiochus did. He was not on the line to be the king. He stole the kingdom. Was pretty good at it, right? He pulled it off. And he was a fairly successful king, actually, but he was just really, really wicked. But how often are kings wicked? Just, part of the fallen reality we're in. Still kings, right? I mean, who puts everybody in charge down here? Everybody who's in charge down here is put down here by God, right? So he runs the whole world. Let's see. And then, of course, he's broken, right? So his kingdom passes to 4 other kings, okay? He's broken off. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more. And this all gets hard to, figure out all the prophetic stuff. All right, so here's how I look at this. If you look at this, there's kind of this end-of-time Alexander figure. I think he is going to be essentially a Christian who will be enabled by God to establish unity around the world for God. God will have him do it. Who he is, who even knows, but I think that's what it is. Because you go to Zechariah chapter 12 or so, and God tells this prophetic figure to be the shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. And for a period of time he does it, and then this guy gets angry at the flock doomed to slaughter, which is all those who do not follow God, right? And he abandons them in his rage, right? He leaves, and he says, pay me whatever you want, I don't give a crap. And then he throws it away, right? So this guy, whoever this guy is, kind of an interesting figure, but he throws the money to the potter, right? And Yahweh says to him, ask for the amount of money they gave to betray Christ, right? So he asks for that, they pay it out to him, he throws it away, he says, I don't even want that, right? And he walks off. And while he's doing that, all the kings of the world watch it happen, and they go, oh, that's not good, right? They realize it's the will of God. So you can look that up in Zechariah. And he destroys 3 kings. What's interesting is that's what happens towards the end of time. 10 of the kings, of the 10 kings who will be there when the end of time starts, 3 of them get wiped out. And you see this throughout the prophetic literature. So there's 10 kings, 3 are destroyed. And it would appear that this particular figure destroys them himself. But it's weird because in Zechariah it says he does it, but in other passages it says the Antichrist does it. Hard to reconcile that, but that's kind of how it talks about it. So I'm not sure. It's kind of an interesting thing, but I mean, who even knows? I mean, maybe the White Rider and the Red Rider are friends or something. I don't know. But the Red Rider is the Antichrist. If you go to Revelation to the Horseman of the Apocalypse, the Red Rider is the Antichrist because he's a warrior, right? More of a Mars figure, right? So the White Rider is more kind of this Apollonic figure. The Red Rider's, he's more of a warrior guy, right? And he's got a sword in his hand. So he takes things over through bloodshed. And if you read in Revelation, that's what people say about him. You can't beat that guy, right? So, I think I said this yesterday, he's like the bully who steals the lunch money. You ain't going to get it back, right? You aren't even going to try. And nobody does, right? So that's, if you read the literature on the Antichrist, he's kind of this warrior guy. And then at the end of that Zechariah passage, it says that God picks for them a king who is something like an evil shepherd, right? So he anoints this evil shepherd to rule over the people that this good shepherd has left because he was so angry about their hardness of heart. And the evil shepherd is the Antichrist. Okay, so, and Zechariah, if you study it, is about kind of like the end of time and the restoration of God's people at the end of time. Okay, let's see. That is kind of how I take that. Anybody have questions? I know that's weird. Allie said, oh, the stuff I did yesterday was weird. So it is, apocalyptic literature is bizarre, right? And the end of the world is promised to be a very strange affair, right? God did not promise it would be normal. And that's why when people read Revelation, they go, what does this even mean? And if you study, for instance, like early commentaries on Revelation, what they did like early, is they would allegorize it. So like early commentaries on Revelation are allegories because nobody knew what to do with it. So they would allegorize Revelation, right? But I mean, the history of the interpretation of Revelation, you kind of look at it, it's like nobody really ever knew what to do with it. And you look at Luther, he said, I was kind of hoping a revelation would be more revealing than this, right? Which is like, yeah, good point, Luther. So people have said all kinds of things about Revelation. And some people, the way they approach Revelation is they don't, right? So I'm just going to ignore it. And in my tradition, right, they said, it's anti-legomena. Don't even mess with it, right? Or not necessarily don't mess with it, but you don't interpret the rest of the Bible through it, which actually is a fair point because it's very obscure. So anything you do when you're interpreting apocalyptic literature, you just have to say, okay, I think this is it, but until it happens, let's not nail it down too tight. Because you also have to remember, when Jesus arrived, they had their own interpretation of the stuff about the Messiah, right? And so when he showed up and he was the way he was and he didn't fit their specs, they didn't think it was him, right? Or they thought he wasn't doing it the right way. So you have to keep an open mind about this kind of stuff, because if you nail it down too tight and it happens a different way, you can miss what's going on, which is not a good thing to do. You want to be on board when it happens. So the best thing to do is keep an open mind. But this is kind of how I approach it. So I think there will come a time when the United States will kind of decline. There will be kind of this worldwide conqueror who will take over, he'll unify it. And from what I can tell, he'll set up 10 kingdoms. But it will arise out of the power of these four other figures. And then the Antichrist will arrive out of that. So that's kind of how I approach it. It's okay if you want to disagree with me, that's all right. That's how I approach Daniel. This particular vision. So that's 7 and 8, and they're building on each other. And so then you get to, I did 9 yesterday on accident, and then you get to 10. It just kind of keeps going. But 10 does not have, the later visions are not quite as explicit as the earlier ones. And then 11's very explicit, and then 12 is just basically a close of the book. So these early ones are much more explicit about what's coming. Okay, well, I think that about covers it. Anybody reading along have any questions about anything in that? It's okay if you don't. No pressure or anything, but... Okay, so that's 8. So I really do think it has to do with both the ancient world and the modern world, which you see in the use that that Gabriel uses. He uses the word kates, so he's also talking about the close of the age. And frequently throughout the Bible, this end word does have to do with kind of the end of time. But it's had multiple fulfillments in history, right? So there have been multiple ends throughout the world, but there will be one great one at the end of time, right? So towards the end, this stuff will be fulfilled again. Kind of a weird thing, but it seems like God kind of like recycles history. So he doesn't just... His book is very interesting, right? So he kind of builds the same stuff over again. And one more comment, and then I'll close. But if you think about what history is, it's really just a book God wrote. And you see this in Revelation, right? So he's holding a seal or a scroll that's sealed in his hand, and nobody can open it, right? And inside of the scroll is the last story. So God has been writing human history. This is his story. And I think what time really is, it's a novel God wrote. I have a theory about time that it's really God writing a story. And delineating history so that it flows in the way he wanted it to. But I think when we return to a post-time setting, he will de-restrict realities so that his creatures can flow more freely again. He's writing a story, and the point of the story is actually quite simple. It's a very simple moral of the story. It's really just that God loves us so much, he wants us to love him back. That's it, to love him back, no matter what. And I think that's really all that story is about. It's about God's love for his creation. And I think some people will say, hey, he's got a funny way of showing it. But actually, the Bible is you find Yahweh's a very patient, loving being in this book.
And if you study the history of the gods, right, he's actually the most generous, kind, loving of any deity anybody's ever worshipped. The creator God, right, Yahweh Almighty, is a very kind, loving, caring God. That's why he's called the Father. And he cares for his creation very deeply, and he wrote a book. And every God who's ever been has written a book. So, and Paul and the apostles do talk about people worshiping fallen angels, right? They did. And there were actually gods in the ancient world. So in a way, the Bible is God talking about how he runs things, right? As compared to other beings, fallen men, fallen angels. He runs it differently. And the Bible is, in a large part, his testimony about how he does things. And so he's writing a story, right? And he wants to invite you into it. And it's a wild ride, right? Nobody reads the Bible and goes, that was, boring or stupid or something. People are so fascinated by this strange book, they just keep making copies of it, right? They just got to keep copying it over and over because they're fascinated by it. It's a weird book. We want to know what it means. But actually, that's the summary of it, God's love. It's very simple. It's not a complicated book. And I think we tend to overcomplicate it. And so he reruns the same plots sometimes, right? And he kind of has them, build on each other. He recycles stuff, but he develops it and he brings new things out of it. Only the true God can do stuff like that. Okay, well, I'm going to shut up. Thanks for joining me. I know that's kind of a weird passage. But the Bible's frequently kind of weird, right? But it always turns out to be true. It's a trustworthy book because God is trustworthy. All right, well, I'm going to preach again Sunday morning, 6 o'clock. I do my Sunday sermons on 6 a.m. At the rising of the sun because our Lord rose before the sun rose as a symbol of a new eternity. A new age. All right, well, God bless you. Thanks for joining me. I'm going to close with the Lord's Prayer. Join me if you want to. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. And if you want to see the other sermons I'm doing and talks and stuff, they're on my website, hawkahall.church. I'm posting a lot of different stuff on there. I did Jonah. All of my Daniel stuff's also going on that website. It took a little bit of time to figure out how to get it off of Facebook, but I finally hacked that, so now that's going to go on the website too. So if you want to see anything I've done, it's all ultimately going on that webpage, hawkahall.church. Kahal is Qahal. So if you want to check it out, please feel free. It's all up there for people's benefit, just kind of working through scripture and also kind of explaining theology too. So if you have any questions, there's an email or you can message me. There's an email address on the website, revkev.com or something to that effect. It's on there. That forwards to my personal email address. All right, well, God bless. Thanks for tuning in, okay? All right.